People in Greece are fed up with being told life will cost more, but they will be paid less. And so thousands of them protested in Athens, angered by the latest austerity measures agreed between the government and the European Union. That's shut down buses, trains, ferries and other public transport. They say more pension cuts and tax hikes will only tighten the noose around the economy and the people.
If these measures are passed, things will be very difficult. And the growth they are talking about is not for us or our children. It's for the capitalists.
This robbing from the workers and the pensioners has gone far enough. They have sunk us to the lowest levels.
Their fears aren't without reason. While the government has announced a number of new projects, unemployment remains high. And after shrinking for 2 consecutive quarters, the economy is officially back in recession. The government has repeatedly cut spending and raised taxes, yet its debt is still growing. The opposition is rallying the crowds to toss the reforms and the government.
There must be a class struggle daily, and for the long term, these harsh, unpopular measures must be thrown into the waste bin of history.
But what they're not offering is a solution. In fact, Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras was also leading similar protests against austerity measures until he took office. Protesters accuse their leaders of playing politics in the face of Greece's economic ruin. And they've packed the streets to tell them they're out of options. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Joining me now from Athens is former Greek Finance Minister Gikas Hardouvelis. Mr. Hardouvelis, welcome back to Money Talks. Let me start with these austerity measures. They look like they are going to go through Parliament, but is this really what Greece needs right now?
Well, Greece does need to regain credibility, and it needs to have a lower primary surplus targets in the future. This is the IMF point of view. The IMF claims that the Greece needs some fiscal space, but more fiscal space implies a bigger debt relief, and this is where the big question is. It's a question that has to be resolved between the IMF and the European lenders.
But a broader question, though. Back in 2011, for example, Boris Johnson, who was then Mayor of London, suggested that Greece should have gone bankrupt and it should have left the euro. Many others have said the same thing. Puerto Rico has sought bankruptcy protection. Isn't this what Greece should have done and perhaps could still do?
Well, Greece actually did declare more or less bankruptcy. It was not an official bankruptcy, but it did offer a debt swap. It saved about 100 billion of euro in terms of its debt. But because the last 5 or 6 years, the economy was in a huge recession, it caused still the debt to rise. So, I mean,
but there are but excuse me for interrupting for a second there, but there are some even more fundamental problems. I mean, you mentioned Europe. Yanis Varoufakis, who succeeded you, has written recently that the bigger problem is actually Berlin, that these are the people who are blocking the progress towards this. Is this something that you agree with?
No, I don't think so. Yanis Varoufakis caused a lot of pain in this country. Back in 2014, the economy had stabilized. We had a current account surplus. We had a primary surplus. We were expecting a growth rate of close to 3%. And Yanis Varoufakis' policies brought capital controls and brought a new recession. Essentially, the last 2.5 years are lost. Back in 2014, the country was able to go to the market and borrow. We issued 5-year bonds and 3-year bonds at very reasonable interest rates. Now, we're still not able to tap the market. We have lost 3 years after we had stabilized the economy. And it was all the fault of the current government, and primarily Yanis Varoufakis.
The IMF seems to be suggesting that Greece needs to be able to grow its way out of this problem. But Greece's ability to grow is really severely curtailed. It doesn't really have any industries of its own. What are the basic fundamental shifts that need to take place in Greece to allow that to happen?
I think the country needs a shock in credibility. Domestic Greeks have to believe in a government. It has to have a growth plan, and it has to completely switch its tax policy. The current government has overtaxed everybody, and we all know that no country managed to have a long-term growth rate with high taxation. The Greeks are overtaxed. This has to stop. And in order to stop, we need some breathing space on the targets for the primary surplus. This is why I said this earlier on.
Great to have you on the programme. Gikas Hardouvelis, former Greek finance minister. Thank you so much.